spares our good and our wise, took away our native tongue, taught their English to our young, and all the things we made by hand are nowadays made in Japan.
Our rank on this earth,
African people,
to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, that we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
whole African nation taught us so-called civilization. Although they've changed our ways of life, they'll never change our hearts and soul. African people, African tribe, so proud we live, so proud we die. But maybe someday when they've learned, African people will return. They've got to return. Power to the African people, they've got to return. We're still black inside. They've just got to return.
We intend to fire our people up so much until if they can't have their equal share in the house, they'll burn it down.
Firstly, we have Mama Marimba Annie, the author of the book Yorubu, to thank for the use of the word Maafa.
I would describe it as a period in African history which goes back at least 500 years. We could argue that it goes back to the 6th century also. But what it incorporates is a period where African people were held in physical bondage, personal slavery, if I can put it in that sense, where the labor of African people was extracted from us.
Now, the Great Suffering never started in just 1492, you know, or 1485 when the Portuguese entered the west coast of Africa. The Maafa started from around about the 600th century, where the Arabs invaded northeast Africa and started to enslave Africans.
The important thing to talk about when we talk about the enslavement of Africans is the fact that it's something which has been going on with a number of different people, not just the European and not just over the last 500 years.
Had it not been for the Arab phase of slavery, then the European phase of slavery would not have been possible.
The current population, substantial Arab population of North Africa, who went there as the result of Arabs who went there in the 7th century AD of this era. This was just after the end of the pharaonic civilization in ancient Egypt.
But it doesn't end there, because there are deeper levels of slavery. And a deeper level of slavery is colonialism. And colonialism is the situation where an alien set of people come and take control of your land. And because they've controlled your land, then they actually have control of everything on your land.
After the Maafa, which is still what's going on now, we're not self-determinate. We're not in control of our own destiny. Before the Maafa, we were self-determinate. And that's the that's the stage we need to get back to. Not to go backwards in time and start being backwards, but I just mean in terms of getting that self-determinate status back. Before the Maafa, when we were self-determinate, we were in control of our own destiny. Whether, you know, we made mistakes or not is another issue. I mean, obviously we did some things wrong, we did some things right, but the point is we did what we were supposed to be doing for ourselves, by ourselves.
To Africans in the British colonies in East Africa, there appeared to be no prospect of any sort of self-government. What made the difference was settlers. These colonies were recent recruits to empire. In the most fertile parts of Kenya, several thousand Europeans had arrived between the wars, taking over African land. They used Africans as servants and laborers. In a healthier climate than West Africa, they moved in for good, leading a life they could never afford at home.
Colonial rule itself, of course, also involved slavery, or what was sometimes called forced labour. And even in many British colonies, you'd find that there was the enslavement of Africans even during colonial rule. It obviously was accompanied with a whole ideology that Africans were inferior, that they couldn't govern themselves, that they had no history, they had no political institutions, they had no economies, and so on and so forth.
Africa, home of more primitive peoples, with colonies spread from the Indian Ocean to the South Atlantic. Control of the destinies of all these colonies lies with the Colonial Office in London. It is here that all plans for the colonies are dealt with, and here all major decisions are taken.
So 700 years of depopulation, of rape and pillage of land, destruction of a people's culture, that's the vanguard. Then you move in and do the colonization. And once you have control of a people, their resources, then you have control of their minds.
So that is a more complete type of enslavement, which is not often referred to as enslavement, but the name used often is colonialism. But even when that was defeated in our history, we moved into a remote kind of colonialism. Kwame Nkrumah called it neocolonialism. And what neocolonialism does is, instead of having a European man with a funny hat on your soil, calling himself the governor of the territory, what they do is they take him home, they return him home, and they get African people from our soil, from amongst our people, and they educate them in a way that they operate against their own people. And so then Africans take on for themselves, or some Africans, or a particular class of Africans, take on for themselves the role of subjugating their own people.
Should Blair's principle of intervention on humanitarian grounds apply to Zimbabwe?
This was the great speech about intervention I think you're referring to that the Prime Minister made in Chicago 4 or 5 years ago.
My judgment is that it's hard for Britain to intervene directly, but I and some other people on a cross-party basis are trying to get a concert together, a fundraising event in September in London, to raise enough money to actually employ lobbyists in those African countries so that African states will put pressure on Mugabe.
Peter O'Dilly's lifestyle is markedly different from many of his citizens. He showed us his new government headquarters, complete with private swimming pool, tennis court and helipad. His spokesman told me it cost $200 million. He's currently running for Nigeria's presidency. I asked him about the problems in the Delta over champagne, his treat. It was Cristal 1999, nearly £200 a bottle.
It's human nature that, you know, there'll always be some people who have no principles and can be used, exploited, really, through the whole process of the Maafa, from the enslavement to the colonialism to the neocolonialism. They find certain unprincipled African people that they can use in that way.
Even if we only take the example of what this government and other governments have done in Africa and are doing in Africa, this is something of great concern. In other words, Africa's being exploited, oppressed, and all this is done under the guise of humanitarianism, of being concerned about Africa, that Africa's a scar on the conscience of humanity and so on. But how is this scar caused? So they never mention the transatlantic slave trade, they never mention colonialism, colonial rule, they never mention the neo-colonial exploitation of Africa.
When diamonds were first discovered on the South African side back in the 1920s, the indigenous Nama people were moved inland and denied access to traditional farming land, fishing resources and wetlands, now polluted by the discharge from the mine.
If everybody must continue to do what they used to do, then we can't develop, we can't talk of development.
Let them call us primitive, let them call us Stone Age people, but our way of life suits us. We have seen their development and we don't like it.
De Beers expects diamond sales to grow at least 10% over the next 5 years. And while the endorsement of rappers will help, it's also launching a more sedate ad campaign later this year to appeal to its core market too.
They set up the IMF in 1944. They set up the World Bank in 1946. The United Nations was slightly after in 1948. But the point is that a whole set of infrastructure was set up in order to control these newly, quote-unquote, independent nations.
The British were proud of the peaceful nature of the transfer.
For Dr. Nkrumah, main architect of Ghana's independence, this is a day of fulfillment. The longing to be free, the need to be free, these are part of the rightful heritage of man, a heritage denied to colonial Africa until now.
The Gold Coast was renamed Ghana, with a parliamentary system modelled on Westminster.
So if you're an independent country, you would have an independent political system. You would based on your own heritage, your own history. But we don't find that in, I think, in any African country. So these are the kind of legacy of colonial rule, this Eurocentrism, the fact that you have political systems which were imposed during colonial rule still in place.
My government in the United Kingdom has laid down its responsibilities and has ceased to have any authority in and over Jamaica after more than 300 years.
An international economic system imposed during colonial rule, which is still in place, and in which the wealth of Africa is being sapped, as people say.
Europe's needs came first. The best land was used to grow the crops they wanted for export, not food for Africans. In the Portuguese colonies, 98% of Africans remained illiterate. Farmers were forced to be labourers on the big plantations for low cash wages.
The reason why we use the word Maafa is because it encompasses all the different forms of subjugation that Africa has come under. So we don't separate enslavement from colonisation, and we don't separate that from the current legacy of today and neocolonialism.
You see, the Maafa for us is the invasion of our land, the kidnapping of our people, the selling of our people, and the raping of our resources, and most importantly, the raping of our culture and our spiritual modality. That is what the Maafa is.
The Maafa is the most heinous and horrific crime against humanity in all of human history. Not one of the worst, but the worst. We need to be clear about that in terms of quality and quantity, the length of time and the severity and the intensity of the suffering that African people were subjected to.
We were at a critical stage in our history before the Maafa encroached upon us, where we had various empires that were coming together. You know, in the same way, lots of tribes, even though I don't like to use that word, were coming together to form nations. And then those nations were becoming, you know, empires and kingdoms. Those empires and kingdoms were also uniting slowly and slowly. It was a natural progression, just like Europeans have had the benefit of being able to do that because they haven't been enslaved. We were doing that before we were enslaved. But with the brutal, you know, chopping of the Maafa coming in, all of that was just, not even just stopped, but reversed and all going backwards.
African history could be divided into two great periods, before the Maafa and after the Maafa. But not after the Maafa, but the Maafa, because it continues. The primary purpose of Islam and Christianity in Africa has been the colonization of African minds with the culture of Arabs and the culture of Europeans.
Religion was the most potent weapon that the enslavers, Arab and European, used to conquer African people mentally and spiritually, which is the real conquest, which is the real enslavement. If you can enslave the mind of the people, then you need not enslave the body. Enslavement becomes self-generative.
The indigenous beliefs and spiritual beliefs that we had prior to Islam and Christianity embarking on Africa are something that we still maintain to this day. Of course, they've been marginalized, they've been undermined. You know, those that carry these so-called missionary agendas have done a lot to convince us that, you know, our primitive ways need to be forgotten. But essentially, our indigenous beliefs, our indigenous spirituality is what has got us through those days of enslavement. It's the spirit and the teachings of our beliefs that has inspired us to resist against what we know to be wrong.
The church had to find justification for this. When the church went into scripture and justified the act through what they call the curse of Ham, it's like, oh, we can use that. And we can say that the curse is the mark of their black skin and they're inferior, so therefore we can use the Bible to justify this.
God decreed by law that slavery be honored and obeyed, being his ordainment. Jesus himself established by law the relation of master and slave. The master must exercise without any weakness his authority over the slave. The master must not hesitate to punish him severely, whipping him with a number of lashes commensurate to the offense. All this, dear brethren, is made known to us by the recorded language of the Bible. Slavery is therefore a divine institution, ordered and sanctioned by God.
We do need to look at the origins of some of the religions that we're following and be brutally honest about the effects of it and the purpose of why we were forced to follow it in the first place. And we were forced to follow them.
Well, I would say that anybody who understood the Christian faith would know that it was not something to be forced upon people. So perhaps anybody who forced a religion did not even understand what the religion was about in the first place.
Worried that the unfiltered word of God will encourage slaves to escape, slave owners themselves interpret the Bible for their slaves, preaching that slavery is a part of God's design.
Running away was defined as a sin. Disobedience to one's master was defined as a sin.
Now, this is not to disrespect our people who are in the Christian and the Muslim religion. I believe that there's a dialogue that needs to be had. We need to be mature enough as a people. Baba Yusuf Ben Yochanan says, religion is the deification of a people's culture. Therefore, religion empowers the people in whose culture the religion is expressed.
So for African people, you know, to absorb that image of God being unlike yourself essentially reaffirms the idea that you are not godly, that you are not, you know, you are not worthy of anything, you are subhuman. And this has had such a detrimental impact on African people to the point where, you know, many of us have rejected our indigenous beliefs and followed this way of Europeans and Arabs.
Who were these people selling Africans? They were Africans who had adopted a foreign doctrine, never saw themselves as Africans no more, and saw themselves adhered to, what was it, Islam? Remember, the Muslims enslaved us before the Christians did, you know.
And we could see this very easily. Why is it that in order to become a follower of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, an African must assume an Arab name and generally Arab culture? And why is it that in order to become a follower of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, an African must change his name and acquire a European name, and generally aspire to European culture.
These are questions we must ask. How did the Arabs become the dominant forces in North Africa? It was a result of conquest. No people willingly give up their land to outsiders. No people willingly give up their land to invaders.
But when the Arabs came, you either was a Muslim or that's it. They raped and pillaged and destroyed. Some Africans embraced Islam to save the slaughter that was taking place.
And I found it very interesting that I had taught African American history for many years, but had only been dimly aware of the role of Jews in that slave trade. What I discovered was that the Jewish role in that slave trade had been very cleverly camouflaged for many, many years. Where Jews were involved, usually they tended not to be identified as Jews, whereas, where Christians were involved, where Muslims were involved, there was ready identification, of such persons by their ethnicity, by their religious affiliation and so on. In the case of Jews, they would be called other things, Portuguese, Spanish, Brazilian, whatever. But, that crucial identification tended to be obscured.
These facts betray the intentions of the Arabs and the Europeans who abused these two religions to create the Maafa, the destruction of Africa, which continues today.
Since Arabs invaded North and Northeast Africa in the 6th century, African people have been enslaved. African people have been trafficked across the Sahara into the Arab world.
One of the expressions of this conflict between Arabs and Africans is what is happening in Darfur in the Sudan, where a lot of Arabized Africans who have been confused by the ideology of Islam are murdering and raping other Africans. So that today in Africa we have two groups of people. One confused by the Arab religion of Islam and another one confused by the European religion of Christianity, who are intent on deserting their African identity, who are confused and who continue to open Africa to the ravages of outsiders.
The first thing we need to challenge is the legality of the so-called slave trade. Because what is trade? Trade is generally some kind of business agreement between two partners who have an idea of how they're going to benefit.
Britain is going to be shouting about how they were the first nation to abolish the slave trade. Well, we know that that's a lie straight away.
When we look at this 1807-1833, we must see it in terms of strategy, politics, international diplomacy. We must also see it in the sense of double standards.
It's a continuation of the same myths that Europeans on the whole, but the British in particular, perpetuated in order to try to explain their own inhuman treatment of African people.
It's, in a sense, it's been a bit of a cover-up because people, liberals and writers, prefer to display the sort of white people as evil colonialists rather than as victims.
Yes, sure.
Do you think that's true?
Yes, I don't know why the Barbary pirates, I mean the Pirates of the Caribbean, which have always been, seen as romantic, of course they weren't, they were an absolutely horrendous lot, really.
So the good men and some women of Cornwall were experiencing in any of these guises precisely what the black Africans were experiencing on the other side of the Atlantic. They were going through exactly the same indignities and cruelties and being treated as less than human.
Yes, and what I think is fascinating, this recent research has shown, is that at any one time in the North African ports there would be 35,000 or so Christian slaves living this horrendous life.
We've got two massive puppets, one's a black character, one's a white character, and we just ask them who they are, and we just elicit assumptions, so they'll automatically often say the black one's the slave, the white one's a judge, or he's legal. We'll say, well, who's richer? They'll often say the white one's richer, the black one's poorer. Or we'll say who's good and who's bad. Of course, they'll say the black one's good, the white one's bad. So, and then we'll say, well, actually, the black one's a chief. He's not poor. He's very, very rich. He's actually a slave trader, so he's not necessarily good. So we start to then shake the ground they're standing on. So would it surprise you if I said the overseer here that you think is the overseer is actually William Wilberforce, the abolitionist? Does that surprise you?
Yeah. My name is Charlotte Wright and my age is 11. I thought that the white one looked bad because he didn't smile that much, but I learned that the black one could also be bad as well. So it was very hard, and I thought it would be really, really simple and easy before I came. I was very surprised.
I was surprised to hear that they were African slave traders. It's really surprising. I thought it was the British people would come and capture everyone with it, want to go nuts. But mostly it's the Africans that give it to the British people.
And how do you feel about that?
It's very bad. I don't think it's nice. Because just separating homes, brothers from sisters, and it's not good.
It was always Caucasoids who were in control of the enslavement of Africans. When I say Caucasoids, whether they're Southwest Asian Caucasoids like Arabs or Iranians or whatnot, or European Caucasoids like Portuguese and whatever. I mean, it was always them that was in control of the enslavement of our people. It's not romanticizing African culture and history to say that we, in our own indigenous culture, do not have the necessary cruelty and brutality to do that kind of thing, unless someone else come and did it first and is in control of it. We just didn't know how to be that cruel and brutal. It was them who was always in control of it. Even when they managed to get some of us to start doing it, they were always in control of it.
When the Abolition Act came through, and one thing we need to remember is that the so-called slave master, he never retired. The so-called slave master never said, that's it, you know, I'm only going to be being a so-called slave master for the next 40 years, and I expect my gold watch and I'm going to retire. Never said that. It wasn't a policy for that to happen. He's just changed the game.
The man in the blue coat is William Wilberforce himself. Unfortunately, the slaves are always kneeling and grateful. That's common, I think.
Why, do you think?
Because this was done in 1952, and they hadn't really got away from the narrative of good white people doing nice things to grateful black people.
No hint of repentance? From the point of view of having caused the pain of enslavement in the first place?
No, this window doesn't show that.
Well, you see, nothing about these people is genuine. Every law that they enact, every political process, every institution, it's got some kind of ulterior motive. That's just the way they are. So even like the 1807, the 1833 acts that they passed, it was our consistent uprisings, which they couldn't handle, that led to that. You know, it was like a pacifying process and a transition from one type of oppression to another. You know, it wasn't a genuine, you know, heartfelt, okay, let's stop our sick behavior.
I think one thing that isn't said about the bicentennial and the whole fuss about 1807 is what happened after 1807. Because it's not true that the trafficking of Africans, the trafficking of human flesh, came to an end in 1807, because it continued up until the end of the 19th century.
The Europeans needed the Africans for the work they could do. They were in no hurry to give them full political rights.
Revolutionary-minded Kikuyus like Kenyatta, part educated in Europe, ignored the fact that the government was teaching the Africans to make better use of their land. The agitators roused tribal grievances. They worked on the known credulity, suspicion and envy of the tribe. With the cry, more land for the Kikuyu people, they distorted the true facts to insinuate that the whites had stolen land which belonged to the tribe.
Paul Bogle operating on the premise that he believed that the African had now been set free, and therefore that they were taking on their rights. Those Europeans, many of whom had cousins or were sitting in Parliament, the British Parliament, reacted towards this call for proclamation in Jamaica brutally and savagely, killing thousands of Africans. The same thing happened with Sam Sharp, acting upon the 1807 proclamation, the 1807 Acts, who attempted to assert his rights and was met with the same kind and level of brutality. In fact, throughout the 1830s, including the Nat Turner revolt, also being inspired by what he believed was emancipation and also being met by the same brutality, we saw an expectation amongst the African for freedom being met by repression by the establishment. So the position and the condition of the African was worse, far worse.
By standing order of His Majesty King George, all slaves of the American colonies who fight for the crown will be granted their freedom without victory.
Sir, we're not slaves. We work this land. Freedmen.
Oh, then you're freed men who will have the opportunity and the privilege of fighting in the King's army, aren't you?
And even if you look at the involvement of British citizens, the involvement of British citizens continued in that trafficking long after 1807.
People who had estates here in this country also operated plantations in the Caribbean and in South America and in Africa.
What kind of people were your family?
Not the aristocracy, you know, from Scotland.
So the master's on the plantation, he's walking through. What do you think the general idea of the slaves towards him? How do you think the slaves felt towards him?
Well, they weren't all saying, "Hi, boss," you know, "Did you have a lovely night last night? Because we sure did." There were good and bad slave masters.
Because of that history, you've got a really nice house.
Yeah.
You've got cane growing over there. You've got people working for you.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel today, right now?
I don't get up every morning and say, well, I should pull this down, or here, I'll give it to you.
What was awkward about that was that I guess I just wanted everything to hit a certain stereotype. He's a decent guy, family man who loves Jamaica.
So what you had happening in England was an industrial bourgeois class that was saying we've got to end this because this is against our economic interests.
The other thing which is true is that the British government, then as now, used what had happened in 1807 as an excuse to intervene in the affairs of other countries even more.
The whole premise of the American society was that it was a society built upon the enslavement of the African. Their economic power was surmounted and held in place by the enslavement of the African. When that area dislodged itself from the British Empire, Britain, in retaliation by 1807, seek to control the economic power of North America. That is why we see movements, 1807, 1833, for the control of the economics of the empire and the control of the economics of the world.
So it set up what it called an anti-slavery squadron, which patrolled the Atlantic, which interfered in the shipping of all its rivals. And it set up special courts, which were called courts of mixed commission in places like Cuba and Sierra Leone and Brazil and other places. So what happened, very often it would arrest those who it said were still engaged in the trafficking of Africans across the Atlantic, release those Africans who'd been enslaved, and then re-enslave them somewhere else. So for example, in Brazil, there would be cases, those Africans who'd been enslaved would be released, and then they'd be re-enslaved and taken down the mines in Brazil, many of which were owned by British capitalists and so on. So all of these things are forgotten about. You don't see government ministers talking about this. Tony Blair will make no mention of this and so on.
1807 is completely insignificant to African people. It's insignificant because before and after the Act was passed in British Parliament, we had African resistance movements and uprisings. 1807 did not liberate a single African individual, and we have to be very clear about that. If we're going to celebrate, commemorate, then we have to know really how significant is this Act.
Africa, the dark continent. Years ago, fierce wars were waged, and the prisoners that were taken were used as slaves. After the coming of the white men, slavery was abolished, and slave trails were replaced by iron rails.
After 1807, it didn't end Britain's involvement, interference in Africa. It actually increased it. And much of the economic relations that Britain had with Africa still involved the enslavement of Africans. So much of those things that were, for example, in West Africa, things like palm oil became important. Much of that palm oil was grown by people who were enslaved. And of course, this economic relationship which Britain had with Africa increased to the detriment of Africa.
Britain claims to have abolished in 1807. Denmark claims to have abolished it in 1802 in some books, 1803 in other books. But, you know, it's obviously before 1807. But that's nonsense also, because obviously the people of Haiti abolished slavery, you know, before that.
Dutty Bookman in 1791 called upon the African to emancipate themselves from that island. That Haitian revolution from 1791 burnt fires that lasted until 1801, 1802, 1803, following on from Toussaint to Dessalines to Henry Christophe.
Europeans, as a consequence, found that it was costing them too much to oppress Africans, that the amount of money and material and human lives, their own lives, that they had to expend in trying to keep Africans enslaved was too much.
And then one of the other key considerations was that if Britain kept importing more Africans into the Caribbean, this might lead to more revolutionary uprisings, such as the one that took place in Haiti. And so that also was to be avoided. And it was much better to, you know, have a breeding program or have some other way of increasing the number of enslaved Africans rather than to keep importing new potential revolutionaries into colonies and so on.
So when they want to come and tell you about they freed us, no European freed us. We freed ourselves. We forced them into making legislations. We forced them.
world pays homage to her distinguished son, William Wilberforce, who died 100 years ago. Statesman, orator, philanthropist, saint, one of the greatest parliamentarians in a great age, devoted the whole of his life to the abolition of slavery in the British possessions. The work he carried out was one of the greatest epics of the human spirit.
You read about William Wilberforce in 99% of the books that you read, and you will think that man single-handedly ended the trade in slaves and paid them reparations.
In 1807, Britain did something remarkable. It ended the slave trade and turned its back on its vast profits.
Man nearly dead.
This was largely down to one man, William Wilberforce.
The British government then tried to tell us that it was Queen Victoria who ended enslavement and that it was Wilberforce who did it, and Buxton who did it, and Clarkson who did it. In other words, that white people freed us. We know that this is a lie. The current British government is attempting to continue this policy.
William Wilberforce is the one that we're told saved us. He's our saviour. He's the one to whom we should be on our knees. We should be, in fact, they should erect a statue to him in Africa by the sounds of things. The way that he's presented as this great saviour of our people.
One man will risk everything.
Payment in kind.
There's nothing you have I'd want, Your Grace.
He'd fetch at least 25 guineas.
The game is over. To speak for those who could not.
They do this to let you know that you no longer belong to God, but to a man.
To make the blind see.
We have no evidence that the Africans themselves have any objection to the trade.
And to lead a movement that would change the world.
The abolition movement did not start with them. It started with that first African that met that European with that whip or gun or Bible or net in his hand. It started with that first African that met that Arab that had a whip in his hand or had a sword in his hand or had a net in his hand, and that African saying, no, I'm not going, and it's me or it's you, but only one of us are walking away from here alive. That's when the abolition movement started. It did not start with Wilberforce.
There is something about William Wilberforce that's been brushed under the carpet for 200 years. And that's that although he ended the trade in slaves, in private, he believed that those Africans already on the plantations should remain in slavery.
Let me make this clear. It would be completely wrong, a mockery of justice and humanity to emancipate these slaves today. To give them freedom now in their present unhappy condition would be to ensure not only their master's ruin, but their own.
They think only of escape, but not out of an idea of freedom which is understandable in a human. The Negro doesn't have these sentiments. If he escapes only because he is sick.
Equiano, Sancho, Francis Barber, the forgotten heroes in this country of pushing forward the agenda of the Africans' freedom. These individuals, as they were Africans, were doing it from a position of humanity. Wilberforce, Clarkson, Sharp were doing it from a position of strategy. Political strategy, international strategy, and economic strategy. And this strategy meant that at one point you could be against enslavement, but at another point you could do good business with slavers.
Wilberforce did nothing. He did absolutely nothing. He stood there and he told the whole world that he was going to stop this from happening out of the goodness of his heart, when all it was there, he couldn't make no money no more. He's like a pimp who sees the police. He's going to stop beating the whole out of the goodness of his heart, when all it is that he know he can't make no money if he's in prison.
He condemned our ancestors in Haiti for fighting for their freedom and advocated that they should be re-enslaved. Yeah? So William Wilberforce was one of the greatest hypocrites.
I think we need to place Wilberforce in his context, and I think the production of him as an icon is frankly very unhelpful, because I think it's associated with the claim that the abolition movement was simply a movement driven by moral force, and that what it demonstrated was how progressive, how forward-looking, how liberal Britons were. And it enabled people to not see the aspects of exploitation and degradation that went on long after slavery, because we'd done this good thing.
How can that help Britain today to remember her history?
Because we have to take responsibility for what we did. Just as the Germans have to know and remember and take in what the Holocaust was in order to move beyond it, so we have to understand that that's our history. And it's not a history that's just to do with black people, it's a history that is fundamentally to do with white people.
William Wilberforce was actually recruited into the abolitionist movement by William Pitt the Younger. William Pitt the Younger was the youngest ever Prime Minister of this country, and he was a personal friend.
So British government goes around creating problems everywhere and then poses as that force which can solve everything. He's a great humanitarian, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's wherever it is. This is how they present themselves.
If Pitt was in favour of the abolition of slavery, then his natural reaction when he heard about the liberation of Haiti would have been to say, "Oh, fantastic! At last we've got an example in the world of Africans freed from slavery." And what he should have done is said, look, we've got resources here, we want to support you. That's what he should have done. He should have sent over a telegram or whatever it is that they had in those days, congratulating them and saying, "We recognise your government." But instead of doing that, he sent 60,000 troops over there in order to re-enslave the Africans who had fought themselves out of slavery.
The cost they paid for it was a terrible one, because there was this international boycott of Haiti, and in the end they had to pay reparations. So it's not that reparations were paid to the slaves, they had to pay reparations to the French for property expropriated and so forth. I mean, one of the reasons that Haiti is today the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere comes out of this, that they do this tremendous historical feat. So here's the only successful slave revolution in history, and basically, okay, we are going to make sure that the contagion of your example does not spread to the United States, does not spread to Latin America. We're going to isolate you, we're going to quarantine you, we're going to make you pay.
Banks, insurance companies, shipbuilders, merchants and grocers all prospered from the slave trade. So why was something so profitable abolished in 1807?
The British don't like the slave trade. They turn against it for religious reasons, moral reasons. The question is, if the British thought it's wrong in 1807, why had it not been wrong in 1707? The truth is the British themselves had changed. They learn more about what the slave trade involved. They learn about the kind of horrors of the slave ships. And when they learn about it, they change their mind and come to think this is something that must be ended.
Firstly, the historic act of 1807 was not an act of humanitarianism. That's the first thing. Secondly, it wasn't something that was just brought about by the change of heart of Parliament. There was a massive campaign in Britain in the 18th century which kind of created the conditions for abolition to take place, and that involved many Africans in leadership.
You had several groups of people who wanted an end to the trade in enslaved Africans, and politically they prevailed. This is why the British Parliament could pass this law.
Abolition was a very popular subject in Britain. As I mentioned before, there was this mass movement in the 1780s and 1790s, which the government actually suppressed. So it was a popular issue, and the government was fighting a very unpopular war against France and others. So they were looking for a cause which they could, if you like, adopt and say, okay, we're fighting this war, we're adding humanitarianism to our war aims. they would unite the population around them and so on.
Publicly committed to spending millions dismantling the slave trade, the government secretly colluded in the creation of a new system of slavery. It was called indentured labor.
Indentured labor is a man or woman putting the mark on a document, a legal document, signing away their freedom to a particular employer for the duration specified by the indenture, 5, 7, 10 years, whatever. You're no longer a free man.
To trade in human lives so soon after the abolition of slavery required high-level contacts. But the man behind the plan was John Gladstone, a former Member of Parliament and father of the future British Prime Minister.
So Sierra Leone has been interfered with by Britain. We can say a British colony more or less for 200 years. If we look at Sierra Leone today, it's still occupied by British troops. It's the world's leading producer of diamonds, so potentially one of the richest countries in the world, and yet it's one of the world's poorest countries with all kinds of problems and so on and so forth. So this is a very good symbol or example of what the combined effects of enslavement, exploitation, colonialism, neocolonialism and so on have done to the African continent.
What's interesting about the Haitian Revolution is that it's the only revolution with the only constitution that outlaws slavery and outlaws discrimination on the basis of race. Now that is historic. That's not in the Bill of Rights in the US. It's not part of the unwritten constitution of the British Empire. But it's part of that history of opposing racism, which actually comes from the enslaved themselves.
So when people tell me that elements of the European Church were responsible for our liberation, my first question is, how come these very people who aided and abetted were intimately involved, most of them had enslaved Africans themselves, how come they would terminate the system? The answer points in another direction.
Hundreds of thousands of years after some of us had left the Rift Valley in eastern Africa, we Europeans returned to this little beach here. And we came because we'd heard rumours of incredible spices, and our Arab neighbours had told us that gold grew like carrots in the field. You just had to pick it up. And it was true. Modern-day Ghana was and is full of gold. So began the baleful history of trade between Africa and the rest of the world, because in the end, to their eternal shame, ultimately what the Africans had to sell was their own people.
Is that the only part of the whole process of enslavement that we know about? Africans sold Africans, that's what we're told. So we repeat it over and over and over and over again, and yet we're not told about the context and the situation of what actually took place.
This is not just a British issue, or for that matter a European issue. It's also an Arab issue, and it's also an African issue, because Africans were involved very much in the slave trade, enslaving other Africans to sell to European traders.
In his search to uncover the facts behind his slave ancestors' story, David Monteith has learned an unpalatable truth, that Africans willingly sold each other. Archibald Monteith was just one of 3 million Africans sold to British slavers. He was then a child, aged about 7.
When a child begins to show traits of being
out of control, he could be sold so as not to allow him to corrupt other children.
There's a final blow.
How do you feel about slavery between African? Well, is there a difference in the way people feel about it looking back?
Okay. I have this feeling that they brought civilization to the area. So maybe slave trade has been kind of neutralized by what they call them, the good things the white man had brought.
Alex Haley gave us an accurate symbol of what took place in his epic roots, where he showed us the Africans who were catching the Africans, but he also showed us in the bush where there were Europeans with guns pointed at the African so-called slave catchers, which means that if they did not carry out the task that they were assigned to do, they would simply be blown away.
When I was in Utica at a conference on women of Africa and the African diaspora, there were some terrible moments at this conference when a Belgian woman stood up in front of about 350 African women and told them that, oh, by the way, it doesn't know what all the fuss is about complaining about Europeans. After all, didn't we sell each other into slavery? And this is always the the sort of the pull or the taunt that is used. And until we actually know our history, that will always undermine our sense of self. We need to know what to reply back.
Now, I'm director of the Royal African Society these days, which sometimes gets confused with the Royal African Company, and sometimes we get nervous African Americans who are researching this, phoning us up and saying, are you anything to do with the Royal African Company? And the line has been, of course not, we're nothing to do with it. We were founded several hundred years later, and we're an academic organization. I'm sometimes a little bit tempted to say, especially if I know they're West Africans, because they have a slightly more sense of humor than Americans, well, actually we are, are you buying or selling?
We have to accept that some African people did sell other African people. I mean, this is just a fact, and we have to accept that as a basic fact. But if we treat that fact in isolation, then we're doing a great disservice to our African people, both at home and abroad.
I mean not to accuse anyone, but to take the shame upon myself, in common indeed with the whole Parliament of Great Britain, for having suffered this horrid trade to be carried on under their authority. We are all guilty. We ought all to plead guilty, and not to exculpate ourselves by throwing the blame on others.
It's like saying that Hitler and his crimes must be excused because a few Jewish people were involved with Hitler in the Holocaust of Jews. Nothing could be more ridiculous, nothing could be more obscene than this kind of argument.
And if you look at it coldly, legally, technically, as a court of law would look at it, the traders were the middlemen, buying and receiving stolen goods. The thieves were the West African chiefs.
See, the whole thing about this selling of Africans is an issue that we as African people have to deal with. This has got nothing to do with what the Europeans did to us. You see, they're trying to move themselves from the erasure of what happened. How they rape us, how they work us for 500 years for nothing, and build up their societies for nothing. And they want to get away from that and say, well, it's not our fault, they sold you. No, never got so.
No one would dare stand up in public in this day and age and say, well, Jews sold themselves because there were some of them who collaborated with Nazis, But they think they can do that to us because there's that complete lack of respect for African people that they think they can get away with saying that kind of thing when it comes to us, and they wouldn't dare say it about anybody else. So we shouldn't let people get away with that, man. That's nonsense.
We're dealing with a situation where the British are essentially the Nazis, and they cannot cope with that. And this is why, we have this tug of war in terms of apologising and in terms of addressing their legacy of what they have done and facing up to the fact that it was barbaric, it was unjust, and that they need to reparate, they need to make amends.
You can't disprove the fact that Europeans have done what they've done to Africans, that Arabs have done what they've done to Africans. You know, you may try to confuse it by saying that some Africans were involved, and we say, yeah, some Africans were involved, but those were your accomplices. They weren't acting on our behalf, they were acting on your behalf.
My mother is from Ijebu in Nigeria, and the Ijebu people were always traders. So there's no doubt that some of the Ijebu people would have been involved in the slave trade. And my mother used to, anytime we went home on holiday, my mother always, on the pretext of taking us to buy rice, would take us to Badagry. And on our way to Badagry, we would often stop at the Marday slave quarters. And there is buried a man who actually used to procure and trade in slaves for the Europeans. And she would tell us stories about how you can always tell families where there was a history of enslaving people, but particularly where they had been bad enslavers, because, traditionally you might capture people from other places and you might call them, Eru, which is the word that some people say can be translated as slaves, but they could also be incorporated into your family.
Ldr Equiano, in his story, he tells us that he was, quote unquote, a slave in Africa, and he tells us that he was enslaved in the madness created by British imperialism. And he tells us that the two things just have no comparison one to the other. You just can't compare them. So the best witness, or the best witnesses that we have, are those people that experience both forms of so-called enslavement. And so Ldr Equiano just poo-poos on this rubbish about we have slavery. He accepted that there was a bondage, but he explained there's just no comparison between the two. So I would refer people to the life story of Ldr Equiano to just quash this rubbish.
What my mother was saying to us, is that you could always tell families where they had mistreated people who had been, they had captured, and that would be that before their women would give birth, they might be told to do all sorts of crazy errands, and they would say that the reason these women were asked to do these things is because there had been a curse from somebody they had enslaved in the past that would say that unless your women do these things before they give birth, they will not have live birth. Now, the curse it depends on whether you believe in curses as to whether they work or not, but I do feel that regulation within a family is an indication and a testimony to this history. But then on the other hand, my father comes from Ibadan, and what I learned from that side now is that that old idea that people just sold people into slavery anyhow for a few trinkets is a misconception, because here my father has the traditional facial markings and that we used to want when we were children, and because to us they were heroic marks. These were the marks given to people so that were they enslaved, they could always be recovered. That that people always wanted to recover their children. And I think these kind of messages are important messages for people in the diaspora in particular to understand. There's always a home for people in Africa.
It certainly can't be the masses of African people at home who are responsible for our deportation. I mean, if somebody came and stole one of my children now, I'd want to get my child back. And it's obvious that that's what happened in Africa. It's obvious that that is what happened. It's just that the history has not been documented in a way to show conclusively that that was the case.
It is not surprising at all that the British media will highly profile what it calls African involvement in the enslavement of other Africans.
We have to really get things into context. You know, as somebody whose parents were born in the Caribbean, I know that there is a big issue within the Caribbean and within the Caribbean diaspora, if you want to call it that, that we were sold by our own people. And, you know, I think that we have to kind of progress beyond that, and we have to really understand not only the circumstances that some of our people were under, but also the fact that this myth is being perpetuated for a specific reason, and it is to divide and rule.
But what we have in Africa are clear examples of African people abolishing slavery. So one of the best examples in some respects is a king of Dahomey whose name was Agaja Trudeau. Now Agaja Trudeau literally abolished the slave trade from Dahomey in 1724. So he actually abolished it. Then what the British did, understand they couldn't get any more enslaved Africans from Dahomey, is they then operated to undermine the whole process. So one of the things that they did is they went to the people of Oyo. Oyo in modern day, what we might think of as Nigeria nowadays. Now, Dahomey, where Agaja Trudeau was king, and Oyo had, they had frictions in the past, so they would have, conflicts and wars in the past. And what they did is they went to the people of Oyo and they said to the people of Oyo, look, there are these people over there in Dahomey, and they're getting tooled up. And what they're doing is they're getting tooled up to come and get you. Then Britain dropped in the slight clause. They said, well, we'll trade with you, but we'll only give you guns to defend yourselves against Dahomey if you give us people. And so it left Oyo in a position where they had to make a choice. Do we lose all of our people or do we lose some of our people? Oyo fell for the trick. So what we have is not only an early example in 1724-25 of African people abolishing the slave trade, but what we have is an early example of British imperialism abolishing the abolition of the slave trade. So you see the whole thing has been turned completely on its head. Now, if we don't know that history, we'll run around and we'll start saying, oh, but our people sold us into bondage. They're evil and wicked.
It appears to be something, a weakness in all human groups, that some people are covetous, they're avaricious, and for whatever other weaknesses, they're prepared to side with the oppressors of their own people.
Now, one of the reasons why these two kings are not particularly remembered is because they did engage in the selling of our people. At the same time as they stopped it at various times, at other points in their reigns, they actually engaged in it. So they're not remembered as heroes, but the facts of their behavior are hidden from many of us. And these things have just got to be exposed.
A noble desire, a time for healing. Welcome to the Republic of Benin, a small democratic nation in West Africa, a land of many wonders. Some people live as fishermen in total simplicity at the lake village in Ganvi. Others live in rural areas where they rely on farming in places like Ouida. For those who desire a faster pace, there's plenty to do in Cotonou, the financial center of Benin. Tourists travel here from Europe to enjoy the city's resort area, which resembles a Caribbean island. When many Africans realized they were being deported into slavery, thousands of them killed themselves, preferring to die rather than relinquish their freedom. That is one of the reasons why many gathered in Benin to apologize.
When Europeans say, therefore, that somehow their activities must be excused because they had a few African accomplices, They're trying to turn history on its head.
Africans fought for our own freedom. From the first African was taken from Africa, we were resisting, we were fighting against the invasion of our motherland.
The abolition movement, the movement of liberation, started from the moment invaders stepped foot on the soil of Africa, and Africans resisted from being captured.
Why don't we talk about the Africans that outlawed slavery, that fought against, like Queen Nzinga and them people? We never talk about them people, do we? About the Africans that rebelled against it. When she rebelled against her father before her, and then she on top of it, see? Fight the Portuguese, you know, against slavery, you know.
There are plenty of examples of African people at home fighting against the enslavement of our people.
In the Caribbean, in the Americas, everywhere where African people were enslaved, acts of resistance grew. And every single day there were acts of resistance. When we look at what people normally call rebellions of the enslaved African people, there is a certain trajectory that we need to understand. That African people were organizing bigger and better acts of rebellion, meaning organizing bigger and better attacks upon the outgoing system.
These were the real abolitionists, if you want to use that word. These were the real freedom fighters.
Glele was another one of those kings who abolished all trade with the British. You're not having anything. You're not having people, you're not having anything. And just cut them off. And then what the British did is they engaged in what they call gunboat diplomacy. Nowadays what they do is they fly planes over like they do in Iraq and just drop bombs on people and just kill people indiscriminately. In those days they didn't have planes, so what they used to do is they used to have the ships, and they used to line the ships off the coast. They used to get the cannons, point them to the coast, and just bombard from out on sea. And that's what they did to Glele and the people of Dahomey when he refused to trade with them.
In Brazil, Palenque do Palmares, which was one such community, existed from 1495 to 1595. It's over 100 years, or just about 100 years, that community resisted. One of the great leaders, one of the great last leaders was Zumbi. And we need to remember these people.
You know, we've got people like Nat Turner, Sojourner Truth. We got the great Dessalines, the Ferocious, Bookman Duty. You're more familiarized with Toussaint Louverture. Yeah, but you know, they big up Toussaint Louverture because they captured him. See, they only big up the ones that they defeat. They don't talk to you about the ones they did not defeat.
Nzinga, who was operating in modern-day Angola, was one of our warrior queens. You know, one of those sisters, soldier sisters, who didn't play. And she fought against the Portuguese to the point where she almost, her reputation developed in kind of mythical proportions. It's almost as though she was being accused of doing things that are humanly impossible. Yeah? But I mean, some of the facts that we have is that she was so determined in her fight against the enslavement of our people that she actually executed her own brother. Her brother turned traitor, and her brother started to work with the Portuguese enemy.
Napoleon Bonaparte was kicking up European face all about the place and conquering up the place. Sent his elite army of 40,000 troops to quell what they call a little rebellion in the island, and sent his sister along, saying to witness the defeat of the Africans and then bask in the sun. Well, hear what? His brother-in-law died in that war. See? And she had to run back to France. See? Because the Africans defeated them.
When we look through the experience of the last 500 years, the African woman was in fact in the forefront with the man. But this is not often spoken about and said. In, for example, the Haitian Revolution, it was almost 50-50 women to man in those armies, in those wars, fighting those battles against the French, Dutch and the British. In the Maroon rebellions of Nani and Kodjo, large groups of women were part and parcel of the Maroon communities, both from the hinterland, up front, in the battles and in the background, keeping the culture of that society intact.
Anyone that knows African women knows that we're not easy. And you know, that determination, that spirit that we have, that determination to survive at any cost is something that, you know, we've carried through historically. So if we look at the Maafa, we know that African women were integral to resistance movements. And, you know, even today you can see that African women are determined to survive, you know, regardless of the external circumstances, regardless of the hostile environment that we live in.
Between 1730 and 1740, Jamaica was shaken to the core by a bloody and terrifying rebellion. This wasn't just a local uprising, but an armed insurrection against an international superpower. What's amazing is that far from crushing the uprising, the British were driven to the brink of total military defeat. The world's greatest military force suffered thousands of casualties. The Maroons, barely a handful. It was one of the greatest upsets in the history of the British Empire. For the British Army, the Jamaican campaign must have been a miserable affair. Plagued by malaria and yellow fever, they found themselves facing one of the earliest guerrilla campaigns known to military historians. In Nani, they were up against a formidable general, a Jamaican Mbandaka who combined military and spiritual powers. She molded a disparate group of rebels into an army that struck fear into British hearts.
We have an example of the Thomas, where African women were held up on deck. They were being, for rape purposes, because they didn't want to rape women who were dirty and soiled because they were in the hole where everybody was vomiting and excrementing and urinating on each other. So what they would do is they'd keep some African women on board, strip them naked, keep them clean, for their raping episodes. But in between the raping episodes, what these women on a ship called the Thomas did is they worked out what the shifts were, when you had the least number of sailors on duty. They worked out where the guns were kept, where the keys to the guns were kept, where the keys to the chains were kept. So they were our intelligence agents up on board. So in between raping episodes, they kept a log of all of these things. And they noticed that there was a period when there were only 8 soldiers, or 8 sailors on duty. And so they marked that period. And what our women did is our women overpowered those 8 sailors, beat them up, took away the guns, took away the keys, etc. And then what they did is they unlocked, the rest of our people, brought our people all up on deck and just took over the ship.
What was happening was that African people were organizing to liberate ourselves as we always did, and we were also becoming better at this organization. Another case in point we must remember is that in Berbice, in Guyana, in 1763, Africans broke into open rebellion, trounced the Dutch, and put a revolutionary government in power for 11 months. And it took this unity among Africans, as well as a combined force of British and Dutch soldiers, to put down that specific act of physical rebellion.
What we don't hear is about an African warrior queen called Kirkland. Now, one of the reasons why we haven't got the enslavement of our people going way south into our continent is because they met up with Kirkland on the way. And Kirkland was not a play sister. Kirkland, when the British went there to look for Africans to enslave, gave them the biggest hiding that they've ever had.
What the Maroons were doing, they were developing a new culture that fused the elements from the continent with elements that they were meeting there in the Americas. And they produced a new culture of survival. And in the most cases, it was a matriarchal culture.
African people on the motherland who actually died fighting to free captured African people in the clutches of the European enslavers. So if you can imagine, here, our people were caught And what would happen is other Africans would say, look, they've got our people. And then they'd actually come and they'd raid, and they would kill off the Europeans and take our sisters and brothers back. Now, you know, they killed off the Europeans, so it doesn't get written down as history.
In 1791, Bookman, who was an African-centered person, organized a revolt, a physical revolt against the French. The French, who were then the leading military power on earth under Napoleon Bonaparte, defeated them. Fact is, there's a staggering feat of African arms about Sandamaa in 1791 to 1804 that we need to recall here because it's so important. African people in Haiti defeated 2 French armies, and I want to underline this, 2 French armies. The French, who were then the world's superpower, were defeated twice by these Africans. Napoleon Bonaparte sent his own brother-in-law, General Leclerc, at the head of the 2nd Expeditionary Force. And the Africans, under people like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint Louverture, Henri Christophe, and others, defeated those 2 armies, but they were not done. The British sent an army. The British would soon overtake the French as the foremost military power in the world. The Africans defeated them also. The Africans also defeated a Spanish army and an army of local whites and mulattoes. We need to put this together and see that Africans in Haiti defeated 5 European armies in the space of a few years. This is a staggering feat of arms.
If we tried to rescue our people, and because they had guns and we didn't, we were not, successful, then what they would do is they would have mass executions in order to put, other sisters and brothers off from even trying to rescue in the future. All of this is just vital, a vital part of our history, which we need to make sure that all of our sisters and brothers know.
These cultural frameworks kept these Maroon communities together and enabled them to resist patriarchal and aggressive cultural influences coming, and also helped them to resist European enslavement way up into the 18th, 19th century. And some of these Maroon communities exist today. If you go to the highlands and the lowlands of Jamaica, you will find Maroon communities still present.
In order to win a revolutionary war, people and arms alone are not the things we need. We need people who are oriented correctly, who understand themselves. And this was the strength of the Africans in Haiti. They knew they were Africans, and their capacity to resist was increased by the fact of the retention of African culture, of their African identity. This is the meaning, ultimate meaning of voodoo.
The Petro cult was born out of a cosmic rage. It is the rage against the evil fate which the African suffered because of his enslavement. The energy from that rage enabled him to regain his freedom by winning the revolution against the Napoleonic forces.
Today, Tony Blair has cast himself in the role of the sinner, expressing his deep sorrow for Britain's role in the slave trade. But in remarks to the black community newspaper, The New Nation, he stopped short of issuing a full apology.
When I first read it, to be fair, I was a little bit disappointed in it. I didn't think it had gone as far as I thought it would go.
Talking about historical apologies and reparations for things that happened hundreds of years ago is to distract us from a much, much more important matter, which is the problems that the world faces today. I repeat, 12.5 million people today are enslaved, and we should be focusing our attention on them and not wasting time on what are, in the end, gestures.
But in the past, Tony has gone that extra step.
I'm very sorry that they were subject to such an ordeal
and such an injustice. That's why I'm making this apology today. They deserve to be completely and publicly exonerated.
If Tony Blair was to apologise, first and foremost, he's got to live out what apology actually is. And the first stage of an apology is to admit what you have done wrong, and you say sorry for that. Second stage is to step to that party who you have wronged, and you find out from them how you can correct that wrong from them. Then you also find out how you can also add to correcting that wrong from your own heart. And then last stage now is for you to go through a process of development so you never make that mistake or commit that action again. That is what you call an apology. That is a living, standing, practicing principle of what an apology actually is.
And do we think there's anyone at all in Britain today who thinks the slave trade was a good thing? Our society has learned that it was a terrible, repulsive thing.
I don't like it when foreigners come into our country and they don't take on the British culture and British values. I quite for the British Empire and things. I'm for slavery, but that's never going to come back.
It's interesting that a BBC poll showed that 95% of them don't want to apologise. No. And if they're forced to apologise, it's going to foster racism.
It was 200 years ago. He had nothing to do with it. How significant can an apology be, which, frankly, as Mr. Brierley said, isn't really a proper apology anyway?
I don't think there's anybody in the country who would not agree that we feel deep sorrow, shame, for what was a trade of 15 million people across the African
So why doesn't
continent.
he just say, I'm sorry?
He also acknowledges in his statement that this was something that was legal at the time. We can't believe it now, but that was the case.
So that prevents an apology?
We have some of us asking the government for an apology. And fundamentally, the reason I have a problem with this is because if someone comes into my home and burgles my home, I should not really have to go to them and then ask them to apologise. If they cannot find it within themselves to say, I am sorry, then clearly, even if I manage to extract some form of an apology out of them after decades of fighting for one, that is not a sincere apology.
See, to regret something don't mean that you're sorry. I regret it happened, but boy, that's how it goes. You understand? I regret that I have to do this, brethren. It's like a man robbing a man, say, boy, I regret I have to rob you, brethren, but I just have to do it. I ain't sorry about it. You understand what I'm saying to you?
Once they apologise properly, it's an acknowledgement on their part that they've done something wrong. And then anybody who is sincere in their apology wants to start thinking about how to make things right afterwards.
Slavery was a crime against humanity, that so many thousands of people, because they happened to be black in the continent of Africa, were literally just dragged from their families and their backgrounds and their communities and transported thousands of miles to become slaves to white people.
Europeans understand that to apologize for something that they have done is really to admit that it is wrong. And some Europeans are still so racist that they believe that they owe Africans no apology. Although they have acted in ways that are consistently inhumane, they feel that Africans should not be granted any apology. Those are racist people.
They've got to get out of this. You know, this really makes me it makes me upset that people in this country are being slated as racist when we're not. You know, we have done everything possible to eradicate it. In fact, it was in this country, you know, it was William Wilberforce who actually effectively abolished slavery and fought all of his life to do it. And it really makes me cross today now. This is, again, political correctness gone insane.
I think we should also celebrate the fact that Britain was at the forefront of the abolition of slavery.
They'll talk proudly about the British Empire, they'll talk proudly about the Industrial Revolution, they'll talk proudly about British wealth and opulence. They'll talk proudly about the abolition and the role that Britain played in the abolition, but they wish not to take any responsibility for the crimes.
He's chosen the words deep sorrow. You could look at the dictionary. That means an acknowledgement of a very sad, painful, suffering period in our history.
But not an apology.
But you do that in order for all of us to go forward.
Should we be apologising for the slavery now, 200 years on, when beneath our very noses there is still a slave trade going on?
The 200th anniversary celebrations there's been a lot of debate inside the black community about it. Some people are very wary of them because they say it's like, you know, why are we celebrating the fact that these people stopped enslaving us? It's like we're grateful for it. I'm not myself so worried about whether people apologise or not.
My question is in relation to the period, the last 1,000 years, 400 of which were taken up by enslavement and 200 by colonization. There has been no acknowledgement to the contribution made to the wealth in Britain and Europe and America by millions of African people. Instead, the Guildhall and other places in London have monuments to the slavers, not the enslaved. Would my right honorable friends set the historic record straight? Would he apologize to people of African origin, both living and dead, for the part that Britain played in the transatlantic slave trade?
Well, Madam Speaker, first of all, I am happy to acknowledge the pain and suffering of those people who were enslaved in times gone by. Indeed, recently I was in Hull, in the constituency of the Deputy Prime Minister, constituency that was represented by William Wilberforce. Because there were people here too who fought, many radical politicians who fought against the slave trade. But I would like in particular to acknowledge also the massive contributions made by Afro-Caribbean and black people in this country today, and to say how much we value it, how much we treasure it, and how much all of us, I believe one of the great things that's happened in politics in the last few years is that every single political party in this country is now committed to a multiracial, multicultural society. And we owe an awful lot to the pain and suffering of those people who went before us.
The British government was an intimate participator in this crime against humanity from the inception. When John Hawkins left England, he left here with the backing of Queen Elizabeth and the government of this country. He left here also with the backing of the English Church. In fact, John Hawkins' ship was called the good ship Jesus.
If they apologise formally, it puts us in a position when we now can say to them, you know you're wrong, we've known you're wrong all along, but now you know you're wrong. Now let's talk about how you're going to make up for what you've done.
He has not done that. Instead, he has given £20 million to his own people who will continue to misrepresent the misery, the suffering of African people, and try to say that we must have a jamboree, a celebration of Wilberforce.
I personally, and this is me speaking personally now, I personally believe that this country has yet to pay for what it did to my ancestors. It hasn't paid for it yet, and I think it has to.
When the discussion of reparations always comes up, it seems like the government or those people that work or side with the government, with the institutions, belittle reparations or trivialize it. You know, they always want to talk about it in just like, for instance, in a monetary way, like, oh, how much is going to get paid? How much money should people have?
If somebody steals a cow, right, and you catch up with them, they have to, you know what I mean, they give you the cow back. If they've already eaten the cow or sold the cow, then their clan has to repair that. So the principle of reparations is not, it's not a convoluted, obscure principle. It's not a selective principle. It's not something that only Africans can claim reparations. You know, people claim reparations every day of the week.
Reparations is not about money. You understand? That's compensation, that's financial compensation. Reparations is about repairing the damage that has been done.
Reparations, we're talking about the word repair. How do you repair the damage that's been done? Can money really repair that damage? I don't know. I very much doubt it.
This may not be a popular thought with my people, but to be honest with you, right now, with the condition that my people are in, I wouldn't want money to be paid over to every African that's living in the UK. Because right now, if we did that, the first thing we're gonna wanna do is find out how many colors of Timberlands we can buy for little baby Shaniqua, you know? And that's what we don't need to be doing. You know, how many puffer coats can I buy to suit every single day of the week? We don't need to be doing that, because at the end of the day, we'd be selling ourselves back into slavery.
If they came around tomorrow and said, right, here's 10 grand, everybody, would we really be that much better off? I don't think so. No, I think reparations has to take place on several different planes, if you like. And perhaps the most important, and it is a worldwide thing, is education. And the education of our people to understand who they really are. Because a lot of us don't understand who we are. And that's causing a lot of the situations that we're in at the moment.
Okay, say Europeans don't want to give Africans reparations. Fine, don't give them, okay? Don't come to Africa and take the oil, the gold, the coal, the coltan, don't come to these countries and pretend that you're better. Don't come to these countries and tell everybody that they must speak your language. Don't come and do all of that then, because you're obviously not of a mature level that you can engage with people human to human. But because you have come and done all those things and taken all those things and done all those things, you have to deal with the humans who are there. And they're always going to be there. You're always going to have people saying, I have a historic injustice that needs to be righted.
The people who enslaved African people were given £20 million in 1838, about over £1 billion in today's money, in order, listen to this, to compensate them. So they said, for their loss.
Some people say, why do people leave Africa and come to Europe or go to America, right? And it's like people say, well, we're chasing the wealth that was stolen from us. Because it's the only way we can get it back, because the people, the Europeans don't want to do reparations. So if they don't want to do reparations, then people will come and take whatever they can, whichever way they can.
We have to unite across ideological and organizational lines, territorial lines, regional lines, national lines. We have to unite and we have to organize around our agenda of liberation. Liberation is our agenda, and all that is part of that agenda must be placed in its proper context. So reparations must be placed in that context.
So if you don't want immigrants to come to your country, but it's a country that you've exploited, then obviously you pay reparations and the people stay in their country. Most of them people don't want to leave their country.
So if we look at, say, the question of reparations, if we write letters to Tony Blair, or we plead with Tony Blair that there should be reparations and so on, this isn't really going to bring any reparation. And in fact, you could say it creates some illusions that maybe Tony Blair is the kind of person who, might actually want to make reparation for the crimes that British governments commit and have committed in the past. But if we think about how we can empower ourselves, how we can become the decision makers, in other words, if we were the government of Britain, or we were part of the government in Britain, how would that, in what way would that have an impact on, let's say, the question of reparations? We can see that it would have a very big impact. That if we were the government, we would immediately make reparation for all the crimes which British governments, the rich and powerful in Britain, have committed all over the world.
Amos N. Wilson, brilliant brethren from the States who's passed on now, sits with the ancestors. One of the things he said is, it doesn't matter where you are as an African, you're always ready for white people to save you, because that's part of the psychology of the culture we were raised with. So it doesn't matter if it's Tarzan or scraggly looking Bob Geldof, doesn't matter who it is. You always waiting for a savior to save you, and the savior never looks like you. Doesn't matter if it's a white Jesus, Bob Geldof, Tarzan, or whatever. It could even be an alien dropping out the sky. They will always not look like you.
Self-determination is about doing for self. It's about taking your destiny into your own hands. It's about not being beholden to anyone else. And, you know, as African people, we need to completely grasp that. We need to completely understand that that means that we do not go begging, we do not ask, we do not demand anything. Everything that we do for ourselves has to come from ourselves.
I know this may not be popular for a lot of our people, but the point is, for those of us that know better, for those of us that should be doing better, for those of us that realize we're not from a childlike race, we're mature, civilized, essence of God people. Perhaps we need to think to ourselves, we're in a position now, in the 21st century, where perhaps us as a people, we need to apologize to our ancestors that went through that Maafa so we could be here today. We need to apologize for them that we haven't been fighting for the true sense of liberation that they died for, what they endured for. And perhaps we need to think, let us apologize to our people, to our ancestors, for not fulfilling their desire that one day, they'll be back in their position that they once was before the Maafa actually happened. And perhaps we need to focus more attention on efforts on doing that than to hell with the government's apology, because we won't then need it.
Many of the most astute observers, great scholars, have understood that language is a perpetuator of culture, so we need to begin with that understanding. But each culture has an ideology, or at least may have an ideology dominant within it at a particular point in time. And the terminologies in a language perpetuate ideology. So Europeans have been consistently trying to project their view or misrepresentation of what happened in the history of Africans vis-a-vis Europeans through the selective application of certain terminologies that articulate their ideology.
I hate it when they call it the African slave trade, because that means that it was controlled by Africa. Africa had something to trade with and was getting an equal share out of the bargain. It was the European slave trade. It was theirs. They ran it, they owned it, they started it.
One of the things that we have to be really honest about with ourselves is that the English language is particularly limiting. So defining our experience as a genocide, as a Holocaust, you know, we're not using our own terms to define our own realities. And this is why, you know, as part of being self-determinate, we have to use our own language, and hence we have the Maafa, which is a key Swahili word.
I mean, I teach a module here at UEL called Children and Language. I love teaching, by the way, and one of the things I've learned from teaching that module is how important language is. I mean, I knew it was, because I knew that I wanted to speak Yoruba, not just because I wanted to be able to communicate with Yoruba people, but because it offers me a different frame of reference for thinking. And sometimes, as a person of African heritage, you need to be able to think outside of the language that you grew up with, because within that language, there are so many traps, so many negative reflections of self, so many negative ways of thinking about yourself, that this other language offers you an alternative framework. And I would really encourage young people to learn an African language.
When you use the term slave, you're actually saying that these people settled voluntarily for this condition. You're saying that the struggles of our ancestors, valiant struggles, unceasing resistance, in fact, did not occur. But when you use the term enslaved African, you're acknowledging that this was a forced process, that there was force, that there was resistance, therefore, and you're far more accurate about your description of the situation.
This is why they use the term slave trade. It's a euphemism. This wasn't trade, it wasn't enterprise. It was a horrific crime against humanity.
The term race didn't exist prior to the 1700s and 1800s. It was the London Anthropological Society in the 1800s, coming from social Darwinism, that decided to also use the term race as a social construct and justify levels of race of people, who was superior, who was inferior. Anthropology was born out of the head of this beast right here, Britain, to justify their actions.
And you do not need a microscope to see the limited cranial capacity and the vile wool that covers it, this low forehead, or the eyes completely lacking in any blue pigment, or the animal-like nose with its dirty wide nostrils and the abnormally strong teeth and this almost Neanderthal jaw are all characteristics of a sub-human race, a race far inferior to our own, a race that is but another example of nature's innumerable attempts to obtain perfection. Ah, nature loves perfection. The perfection of the European Homo sapiens, the white race, us.
Okay, so we're told constantly that, you know, the Maafas ended, that slavery finished 200 years ago. But we know this isn't true. In the same way that they tried to get us to forget our names and our languages, our indigenous beliefs, they continue to do that today, and they do that through language. So we're told that rather than being African people, we're black people, you know, we're coloured in people, we're Negroes. And, you know, we know for a fact that it was not black people, it was not Negroes that came out of Africa, it was African people that came out of Africa.
We hear a term like plantation, and over a period of time, plantation has come to represent a far more benign situation than it really was. The plantation was a place where Europeans physically, culturally, and psychologically tried to obliterate African people. They tried to turn us from human beings into factors of production, full stop, nothing else. They listed us among their cattle, horses, sheep, goats, dogs, mules, machinery. Therefore, they attempted to depersonalize us, to dehumanize us. And any vestige of Africa on the plantation was given a big negative value and often attempted to stamp out. Europeans understood. They might have been evil, but they weren't stupid, and they understood that an African who retained an African identity was somebody who had a capacity for resistance.
History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells of people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells a people where they still must go, what they still must be. The relationship of history to the people is the same as the relationship of a mother to her child.
What you see before you is a record of the experiences of the Africans in this country. And the reality of our experience here is that it's a hidden history, it's a secret history. It's a history that's just kept privately, secretly, and this is a good representation of that reality. And yet Africans walk up and down this street every day without noticing this strong representation of themselves. And it's just like Professor John Henrik Clarke says, is that African history is not a separate branch of history, it's the missing pages of history.
When people start telling me, oh yeah, but it was in the past, you know, it was long ago, why are you bothering about it now? It's kind of like, well, you know, if it wasn't for the past, if it wasn't for long ago, I wouldn't be standing here. Long ago and the past actually is quite important. I am now making my past for my children. They will make their past for their children, you know? And that's why it is so important that we keep it in the forefront of our minds all the time. We must never let our people forget.
Why I would say is that the Africans are the only people who are always encouraged to forget their past. As members of the human family, we are the only ones that are always told it was too long ago. Yet I know that if you go to any half-decent scholar, let's say a scholar of the conflicts in Northern Ireland, they are going to at least root that history back to William of Orange. And that was, what, 300-400 years ago?
I was born and raised in this country. I've been reminded since my earliest years about William the Conqueror, about the ancient Britons, the Celts, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, World War I, World War II, the Battle of Britain, Churchill. People in this country never cease to remember what took place on these islands and how they've influenced the world. That's why a young British person born and raised here with no education can walk over into Germany or to Portugal or to Belgium and say, we are conquering your country. Why is he doing that? Not because he knows his history so well, but what has been handed down to him broadly. It's at the back of his mind. He thinks we are great. And if we think that our history began with slavery, then we were only ever enslaved. If we don't remember the fact that we had great universities, that we understood science, art, poetry, literature, then we will think these were European inventions.
But we in Scotland have a historic link with Malawi that's very special. David Livingstone and others discovered Malawi back 150 years ago. The Church of Scotland built the Malawian education system that was once the best in Africa. And the Church of Scotland and many other Scottish organisations are still active in the country today.
People are confused because when the European mentioned the Dark Ages for him were not the Dark Ages for other people. Concurrent with his Dark Ages, the African had his third golden age.
As Europe suffers, three great kingdoms are emerging in West Africa: Mele or Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. These were lands of enormous wealth. The kingdoms were known for their benevolent governments and their great respect for learning.
For a while in history, there was only two great universities. The University of Sankore at Timbuktu and the University of Salamanca in Spain. And the African was solely in charge of the one at Sankore and part in charge of the one at Salamanca.
The past is the only substantial experience we have to stand upon. It is the past that tells us what happened. It's our memory that saves us from repeating mistakes we've made in the past.
See, I'm not interested in whether Europeans or any other group of people don't want to remember what happened. It's about us. It's when I hear young Africans around the world, and it's not just here in Britain, it's on the motherland, it's in the America, anywhere you find it, you hear them saying, oh, but that was in the past, man. Yeah, we know that slavery exists, but like things are different now. Things are different what? Things are different because what? You still work on the plantation. He might pay you £100,000 a year. You might be a singer, a rapper, a ragga DJ, or whatever the case may be. You might be earning loads of money, but that's you. What about the rest of your people? You know, it's no good you basking in the millions and all the rest of it, and the rest of your people is still suffering.
If you can imagine, right, you've got a nation or like an alliance of nations who enslave millions of people, literally millions of people, and make them labor and labor and labor away all day, every day, for hundreds of years without paying them. The kind of massive economic advantage that's going to give you as a nation. Imagine if our African nations enslaved Europeans and did that to them, the amount of damage it would do to them, and also the amount of benefit that we would get from it. You get a completely unnatural advantage, right, in terms of your economic and social development. It's unnatural. I'm using that word deliberately because it's not something that you could ever have possibly have done self-determinately with your own people and your own resources.
You know what? I talk about history for a very simple reason. When people talk about mental slavery and you don't know what that is, and you seriously think, oh, they're just talking fuck, yeah, they're not talking nothing that's got nothing to do with me. It's nowadays, there's nothing wrong no more, and I'm free. You think that people are talking nonsense to you, but now I know firsthand that I was mentally enslaved. I didn't know what was going on around me. And if I didn't know my African history, I wouldn't be the man standing here today. I wouldn't have fixed myself up after spending 2 years when I was 16, when I was 14, acting like an idiot. Coming out with poor GCSEs and having to go and retake them again. I retook them and I did well only because I started to learn who I was.
They're trying to say that African people are not real people, that we don't have history, don't have culture, and all kinds of things. We could spend a year talking about the examples of this. It is in every single area of knowledge, history, literature, religious studies, biology, the sciences, you just name it. The human sciences, the natural sciences, it's there. Often unspoken, unarticulated, and therefore even more dangerous because it's so deeply enmeshed in the whole fabric of the Western view of the world.
A new chorus of scientists reprised the amateur suspicions Thomas Jefferson had voiced a generation earlier. Doctors measured skulls and identified diseases that only afflicted black people. One concluded that in bodily structure and economy, they were closer to apes than to Europeans. In Philadelphia, Dr. Charles Caldwell published 2 long essays on the inferiority of Africans.
What is the difference between the Kofi Anans? You know, Kof in Hebrew means a monkey, a simian, a primate, a baboon, a orangutan, a gorilla, a ape, a monkey, dear viewers. What is the difference, dear viewers, between these 3 and the black racist anti-Semites, whether it's Kofi Annan, whether it's Colin Powell, whether it's Jesse Jackson, whether it's Al Sharpton, whether it's the Farrakhan trash can? There's a whole list of black racist anti-Semites. What is the difference between them and these 3?
What has happened to the history of Africa post the last, I would say, 300 years? Because before the 300 years, many Europeans knew exactly who they were dealing with, who they were trading with, what those people had contributed to their own civilization. So for instance, without African cosmological and religious or belief systems, there would be no form of Western Christianity, and that is irrefutable.
We had universities, we had colleges, we had libraries, we had whole civilizations before Europeans came and, you know, kidnapped us, raped and pillaged and did their other little things, you know. And it's just a lot of children that I work with don't understand any of that, and it's really painful to work with teenagers, 15 upwards is mostly the age group that I work with, and to speak to them about their own history and then to turn to me and say, I'm not African, miss. I'm not African. Africa's nothing to do with me.
the master, the mistress, Father Raphael, they all said I was possessed by the devil for associating with those heathen Africans.
Look, Father. See? Look, over here, see? This is a heathen's work. She's gone and mixed herself up with a heathen.
Figurations are very similar. Look at this. Certainly heathen were African.
A lot of our people don't know anything about where they came from or about who they were before the whole slavery thing. You know, our history isn't just slavery, but a lot of our people believe it is. You know, a lot of our people believe that, and I think a lot of British people as well believe that we were just sitting in Africa waiting for them to come along and enslave us. So we'll just sit, oh, haven't they come yet? And
as the work progressed on this site, a total of 18 sculptures were unearthed. Many were lying just a few feet below the surface, and one of them was the head now in the British Museum. This sensational and unexpected new find was reported with great enthusiasm by an American anthropologist, William Bascom, for the Illustrated London News. Such was the high quality of the work that he likened the unknown people who made them to the great Italian Renaissance sculptor, Donatello. He wrote, "Little that Italy, Greece, or Egypt ever produced could be finer. The sight of such a large group of refined naturalistic work had a profound effect on Europeans. But the idea still persisted that they couldn't be the work of Africans." In his article, William Bascom wrote, "How in a comparatively obscure corner of this vast and backward continent could an art and a technique have flowered that take their stand beside the best ever evolved by the elaborate civilizations of Europe and Asia?"
In the words of the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey, "Be as proud of your race today as our fathers and mothers were in the days of yore." We have a beautiful history.
It is our memory of the past and what we do with that memory, how we understand it, how we organize to learn the lessons from that past, and how we implement our knowledge of those lessons. It is that and that alone that prepares us to face the future with confidence, with organization, with determination, and with an understanding that together guarantees success.
I have to have this conversation so many times that I'm tired of having the conversation, but when it comes to children, you have to keep going, you know, because they don't understand where they're from. And because they don't understand where they're from and how powerful they are, they believe everyone else telling them that they're not powerful, that they're worthless, that basically they will never do any good at school, that their whole life has been dictated to come out of school, don't get any grades, and go straight to prison.
The Honourable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, he said that a person without a knowledge of their history is like a tree without roots. And a tree without roots is dead. Dead. And as a people, if we become cut off from our history, we become dead. We become dead to self-value, self-worth, self-love. And that makes us open to destruction, self-destruction. So now we have self-hate, we have self-loathing, we despise ourselves. And if I'm not correct, I think the so-called brother in that same program, Shoot the Messenger, suffered from all those symptoms.
I used to teach. The kids who do the best in school are the Chinese and the Asians. They don't get taught their history.
But maybe they didn't have their culture systematically destroyed by slavery.
Slavery. Game over, checkmate. The rule is the first person to mention slavery wins.
We have got to get over slavery.
If you look at all the great people in our history, even in our recent history, you look at the Malcolm X's, you look at the Marcus Garveys, people like that, the Martin Luther Kings, what did they all have in common? They all had a knowledge of who they were, a knowledge of their history. And they all use that knowledge of their history and try to actually educate other people into that knowledge. And that's what made them great.
We need to forgive and move on so we can be free.
Forget your history so you can move on. That's a contradiction of terms. To move on means motion, it means movement, yeah? There's a difference between mobility and motion. Mobility may take you to a point A to a point B. Motion is movement, so you can still be standing still but be in motion. Motion is key to development. There is nothing of any type of living organism that does not have motion in its person. Down to the smallest cell, up to the biggest living organism on the planet. I think it's the redwood tree. All have motion, and everything in between has motion in its person. Why? Because it has a root beginning that has helped it to get to where it is at that point, and it exists so others can take it further. So that single cell can develop into a multi-cell organism. So that seed can develop into a redwood and produce more seeds for more redwood. Even a redwood has a history of origin. The cell has a history of origin. And isn't it amazing that all of a sudden Africans don't need no history of origin, but yet we can still move? That's nonsense.
One of the things that we have to really deal with is this whole notion of us forgetting our history. And, you know, we're constantly told that we need to forget about it, we need to move on. And, you know, it does come up a lot in our music, in our literature, in our films. And the reason it keeps coming up is because it's something that has not been resolved. So until we resolve that, it will continue to manifest itself. You know, no one else is expected to forget about their history. It's only African people that can't remember.
So I've got absolutely no time whatsoever for these fools who feel that, oh, we just need to move on. Of course we need to move on. Don't patronise. We need to move on, of course we do. But you can't move on unless you're ready to move on. And you can only be ready to move on when you understand who you are, how you got here, and what the process was of you getting here. You understand the mistakes you made in the past. You understand where you've been good in the past, so that you can build on that. You understand the mistakes so that you don't repeat them.
He's looking at us, he's looking at we, he's looking at Lucky, he's looking at Lucky, yeah. He's looking at you, he's looking at me, he's looking at us, he's looking at we, look at self-love, self-preservation, self-love, self-preservation, self-love, self-preservation. Take a look at it. Self-love, self-preservation, self-love, self-preservation, self-love, self-preservation. He's looking at self-love, self-preservation, self-love, self-preservation, self-love, self-preservation. He's looking at his...
You're a black man, you're an African. No mind your nationality, you have got the identity of an African. Cause if you come from Clarendon, and if you come from Portland, and if you come nationality, you have got the identity of an African. Cause if you come from Clarendon, and if you come from Portland, and if you come from Westmoreland, you're an African. So don't care where you come from, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. No mind your nationality, you have got the identity of an African. Cause if you come from Trinidad, and if you come
We have to have the type of understanding of Africa and the type of understanding of our people here in order to build a bridge, a contact